Section 1, May 15th, 1847. The date carved into the back of that photograph, the day they were to become priests, servants of the divine. But not one of them ever celebrated Mass. Not one ever held a chalice. Not one ever stood before a congregation. Because that night, they disappeared. All 12. Official records claim a fire consumed them, that the east wing of St. Augustine Seminary collapsed in on itself, entombing the students in ash and stone. But I've seen the structural reports, the ones the church buried. The east wing wasn't where they slept. It was where they studied, where they prayed, and beneath it was nothing, or so they claimed. But there were footprints. 13 sets of them, discovered days before the fire, tracked through dust that hadn't been disturbed in decades. They led from the altar, not to the dormitory, but to the old chapel basement. The one sealed in 1848 due to structural risk. There's no record of what lies beneath it. No map, no blueprints, just whispers. A stone spiral staircase, symbols older than Latin, a scent like blood and roses. And one other thing, only one set of footprints came back up. Tonight, we're not just telling a ghost story. We're peeling back the skin of a wound the church spent 2 centuries trying to cauterize. What happened to those 12 men wasn't death. It was initiation. And if you stay with me, really stay, I'll show you the door they opened, and why it's still open. Because the greatest lie the church ever told wasn't that demons were real. It was that they were banished. Section 2. St. Augustine Seminary was built on sacred land. At least that's what they told the parishioners. But the soil it stood on had been sanctified long before the first cross was ever planted, before the Irish settlers, before the Protestants, before the Jesuits. The stones that formed its foundation came from a quarry whose workers refused to speak of what they saw after sunset, a place where compasses spun and voices echoed from caverns that had no walls. The original blueprints of the seminary, dated 1823, show no substructure beneath the chapel. But when Bishop Francis Kenrick visited the site in 1822, he delayed construction for 6 months, no explanation given, just a note in his private journal. The altar must be built directly over it. Over what, he never said. Some say he was following ancient directives, instructions buried in Vatican archives that have no digital record. Others believe he wasn't building a seminary. He was sealing something in. And yet, the seminary thrived. Dozens of priests trained, hundreds of sermons preached. The East Wing, where the class of 1847 lived, was the heartbeat of devotion in a world trying to forget God. But in the winter before their ordination, something shifted. The dreams began. 12 men, each receiving the same vision. A voice, feminine and cold, calling them by name, but not the names their mothers gave them. Names older than Latin. Names that throbbed like blood beneath the skin. They would wake trembling, weeping, unable to speak the syllables aloud without retching. They didn't tell the priests. They didn't have to. Because by January, the walls began bleeding. At first it was dismissed as condensation, rust in the limestone. But then it moved, flowed, formed patterns, spirals, rings, eyes that never blinked. Father Brennan painted over them. Twice. By morning, they returned. And then the animals came. Not wolves, not deer, not anything natural to Pennsylvania. Witnesses described them as shapes, forms, standing at the edge of the tree line in the dead of night, watching, always watching, not moving, not blinking, as if waiting. The 12 seminarians began spending more time alone, speaking less, praying longer, sometimes together, sometimes in silence, but not to the God they were taught to serve, because what had awoken beneath the chapel was older than God. Section 3. There are truths you can read in books. And then there are the ones etched in silence. Truths the bones remember even when the mind is ordered to forget. The kind of truths whispered by candlelight in locked rooms, behind doors thicker than trust, beneath symbols too ancient to translate. That's the kind of truth the class of 1847 discovered. One of the seminarians, James Fitzgerald of Philadelphia, began keeping a journal in the months before the ordination. A plain, leather-bound volume kept hidden under the floorboards of his cell. It was found by a groundskeeper in 1912, during unauthorized repairs to the East Wing's ruins. The church confiscated it within hours, but one page, was copied and smuggled out before the archivist vanished. I've seen that page. James wrote, "We are being taught two gospels, one with words and one with presence. One speaks of Christ crucified, the other speaks from below the altar, and it does not ask for worship. It demands offering." They had already begun the offerings, not of blood, not yet, but of obedience, silence, identity, the kind of offering that separates who you were from what you're becoming. The seminary staff began noticing it too. Not just strange behavior, but sameness. 12 men moving in absolute coordination, speaking less, staring longer, reacting to sounds no one else could hear. Francis Benedetto, the seminarian who once dazzled faculty with his theological precision, stopped quoting scripture. Instead, he began speaking in fragments, riddles that seemed to mirror the apocryphal texts banned from seminary study. Phrases like, "The womb of light is pierced only by shadow," and "the oldest altar was made of bone, not stone." Then the disappearances started. 2 cats, a lamb, a groundskeeper's dog, gone. No blood, no tracks, just a lingering smell like wet incense and burnt myrrh. One priest, Father Peter Kowalski, began sleeping with a crucifix pressed to his chest. He told the cook he'd begun dreaming of the chapel floor opening like a mouth, swallowing the seminarians one by one. And always, the 13th figure, the one in the black vestments, never moving, never speaking, just standing behind the altar, where no one but the bishop is ever permitted to stand, watching the ordination that had not yet happened. And each dream ended the same way, with the 12 kneeling and the 13th raising his hand. Section 4. Millbrook was a quiet town, conservative, suspicious of outsiders. But when the bishop's letter announced the May 15th ordination, the town stirred like something ancient beneath ice. Families arrived early, mothers in bonnets, fathers in wool coats stained with soil and sweat. They came bearing bread, wine, and pride. Their sons were about to become priests, vessels of divine authority. But what none of them knew was that the 12 had already stopped preparing for ordination. They were preparing for something else entirely. The night before the families arrived, Brother Thomas discovered the first symbol carved into the wood of the confessional. It wasn't Latin, not Greek, not Hebrew. It was pre-symbolic, etched language, the kind found in the catacombs beneath Jerusalem or on the walls of Göbekli Tepe. A spiral swallowing itself, a snake devouring its own echo. He brought it to Father Whitmore, trembling, but Whitmore said only this: "Seal the confessional. Tell no one." By then, it was already too late. The 12 had begun fasting, but not from food, from communion, from Mass. from God. They refused the sacrament. When questioned, they responded with something worse than rebellion. Laughter, not cruel, not mocking, knowing. As if they had tasted something beyond what wafers and wine could offer, something more ancient than Calvary, more complete than resurrection. It was Francis who first said the phrase, the one that would later be found carved into the underside of the chapel altar in blood. The Mass of man ends in silence. The Mass below begins in fire. The night before ordination, the seminary bell rang out. 12 times. Then 12 more. Then 12 again. Not the hour. Not the call to prayer. Something older. A rhythm tied to blood, to breath, to bone. A summoning disguised as tradition. When the priests arrived, the chapel doors had sealed themselves. The stone groaned. The candles blew out without wind. And inside, behind that sealed oak, the 12 had begun their other ordination. They were not kneeling before Christ. They were kneeling before a shadow. Section 5. There are thresholds you cross in life without knowing. Moments you mistake for coincidence, but are really contracts. Silent ones, ancient ones, ones that don't require your signature, only your attention. May 14th, 1847, was such a moment. The faculty didn't sleep that night, not because of fear, not yet, but because of expectation, an unease that clung to the walls like damp air before a storm. The 4 remaining priests, Whitmore, Mills, Brennan, and Kowalski, each reported hearing footsteps that never reached a door, chanting that faded when approached, candles flickering in rooms with no draft, and always that smell. Sweet, thick, like incense mixed with rot. By 2 a.m., Father Mills made the decision to check the east wing. He brought a lantern. What he found froze him where he stood. Each of the 12 cells, open, each bed, empty, each desk, bare. But carved into the wall of every single room, in what appeared to be dried blood, were the same 3 words. We are chosen. Not I. We. When Father Mills returned to Whitmore's quarters, he was trembling. He tried to speak, but couldn't. Only when Brennan arrived and took his hand did he whisper, "They're not boys anymore." At 3:33 a.m., the chapel bell rang. 3 tolls, then silence, then 3 more. It was the signal. The priests rushed to the chapel, but the doors sealed, impossibly, completely. The key turned, but nothing moved. The wood had hardened like stone. From inside, they heard voices. Not 12, 13. Deep, rhythmic, pulsing with purpose. But the words were unintelligible. Not Latin, not even human. The sound didn't enter the ears. It bypassed them. It settled behind the eyes. It pressed against the chest. It felt like drowning while staring into light. And then the floor shifted. Not all at once. Slowly. Deliberately. As if the building itself were waking up. The priests felt it. A vibration through their feet. A groaning from beneath the stone. And then the altar moved. The room inside, when they finally forced the side door open, looked like a crime scene from another world. Books torn apart, candles melted into strange glyphs, and where the altar had once stood, a hole. Perfect. Circular. Wide enough to swallow a man whole. It wasn't part of any design. It wasn't in the blueprints. But it was waiting, and it was open. Section 6. There's a sound the earth makes when it remembers what we buried inside it. A low, ancient groan, like bone bending under pressure. That's what the priests heard when they approached the edge of the hole. It wasn't just sound, it was presence. Something that hadn't moved in centuries was stirring. Father Brennan held his lantern out over the edge. The light disappeared almost instantly, swallowed by blackness too thick for reflection. Stone stairs spiraled down the shaft, hand-carved, uneven, worn smooth by centuries of feet. But none of them had ever seen it. No seminary records, no folklore. Not even the old Irishman in town who whispered of spirits in the pines and demons in the dark. None had ever mentioned a well beneath the altar. Brother Thomas was the first to speak the truth aloud. "This isn't part of the seminary," Father Whitmore answered without turning. "No, this is what the seminary was built around." They stood there for nearly a minute, frozen, listening. But what they heard wasn't sound. It was memory. Something brushing against their minds like fingers through pages. Images. Heat. Symbols. Hunger. And then, silence. Total. Too total. The kind of silence that presses against your lungs and tells your heartbeat to stop trying. Whitmore finally looked at his brothers, one by one. His eyes were different now, older, cracked. "We're not alone," he said. Then, a voice. From the dark below, clear, young, familiar. "Do not grieve for us, Father." It was Francis Benedetto. But it wasn't his voice, not completely. It carried something underneath, like two voices speaking at once, one human, the other ancient. "We go where priests may not follow," it said. "We carry the light inverted." The stairs began to pulse, not visibly, vibrationally, like a heartbeat coming from beneath the stone. And then, for the first time, something rose from the hole. Not a hand, not a face. A smell. The same sweet scent. Rot and roses. Blood and frankincense. It filled the chapel in seconds. Father Mills doubled over, retching. Brother Thomas collapsed to his knees, whispering the Lord's Prayer in broken Latin. And then, silence again. The priests backed away. They did not descend. They could not. Something in their blood told them, if you step down, you do not come back. But the 12 had already made their choice. They weren't taken. They followed. Section 7. By sunrise, the altar had returned. No one moved it. No one saw it slide back. But there it stood, perfectly aligned with the chapel floor, as if the hole beneath it had never existed. The priests searched for the spiral staircase, the symbols, the scattered books, but all was pristine, untouched, except the prayer books of the 12, gone. Only one item remained out of place. A small, folded square of parchment placed where Francis Benedetto had last stood. It bore no name, no seal. But when Father Whitmore opened it, his hands began to shake. It read, "The door has opened. The 12 have answered. One remains to tell." They didn't understand it then. They thought it was some cryptic warning. But in time, they came to understand. The 13th hadn't led them. He hadn't followed them. He had watched. He bore witness to their departure and sealed the covenant. A priest of the old rite. And he walked among them still. The bishop was informed. Philadelphia sent men in black coats before noon. They arrived in unmarked carriages, said nothing to the townspeople, and sealed the east wing immediately. Within hours, the entire chapel was closed, declared unsafe due to subterranean instability. But the townspeople had questions. Where were the 12? Where were their bodies? Where were their robes, their crucifixes, their names, and why had the bell rung in threes? The church's answer was fire. A terrible blaze, they said. No remains. Nothing survived. Yet not a single scorch mark touched the chapel walls. The fire consumed only the dormitory, and even that looked more like design than disaster. Controlled, efficient, surgical. Father Kowalski retired that year. He never spoke again. Father Mills was sent to South America on missionary work and never returned. Father Brennan was found dead in a rectory in Chicago, throat slit with a communion knife. Only Whitmore remained, and when he did speak of it, once, only once, he said this: they weren't priests. They were keys. Keys to what? He would not say. But his eyes were clear when he spoke. Terrified, but clear. You see, this wasn't just about missing seminarians. This wasn't even about the church. This was about something deeper, a structure beneath all structures, a liturgy older than language, and that's where we're headed next.